Dr. Kaylee.
And I'm Dr. Ashley, and we are both psychologists.
Welcome to the 5th episode of our podcast, Do You Ever Feel? In these episodes, we'll talk about common experiences and dilemmas that people face. We'll unpick some of the psychology behind that, and also thinking about some strategies and advice that you can put into place which will help. This episode is going to be about, do you ever feel overwhelmed by your emotions? And we'll be focusing specifically on trauma. So firstly, it's helpful to think about what trauma actually is. And I think Dr. Dan Siegel defines it very well, where he talks about trauma as being an experience or event that leaves us feeling overwhelmed with our capacity to cope. Mm-hmm. And it's very much about how we react to these events that happen to us. So there are some symptoms that people can experience after a traumatic event. It's not an exhausted list that everybody will experience all of these symptoms. You might experience some of them, or many of them, or all of them. It's very individual on how people can respond. Some common things that we find when people have experienced trauma is that they feel a lack of sense of safety. They feel hard to trust people. The world around them becomes quite a scary place, and they can feel helpless and hopeless. There are specific symptoms where people will avoid certain things, so avoidance, and that would be avoiding specific places or situations, sometimes people that remind you of the event, so that can be quite socially isolating. And we can sometimes experience avoidance in ways of how we respond to the emotions that come up for us, so that will be very much detaching from our feelings because they feel so overwhelming, so difficult to face. That sense of vulnerability that we feel can be very scary, so it can be quite common for people to detach and then feel numb. As well as that, people experience intrusion. What we mean by that is like intrusive thoughts or having memories come up for us that feel really distressing, and they can come up in unexpected situations and unexpected times, so we're not necessarily feeling equipped to cope with them when they crop up for us. And also we can experience having like frequent nightmares, which impacts our sleep, and we find that people can experience irritability and anger more often. And it can even affect things like focus, attention, and memory as well. So there's a variety of things that people can feel following a traumatic event. They might not feel these things immediately, they might come up over time. Can you tell us a little bit more about what the experience of trauma looks like for people?
Yeah, certainly. So I think the most important thing to note is really that traumatic experiences, they're very individual. Like, so for example, what I mean by that is like one thing, an event that I might find traumatic might not be traumatic for you, you know, so it's down to the kind of how that person interprets the situation. But what you tend to find is the more scared that you feel, the more like out of control that you feel, that tends to be when you experience it as a traumatic event. Right. But as it's very, very personal to each individual. Everyone's different, with different things that they would find traumatic. And I suppose like trauma, it does serve a purpose. It's not obviously a nice thing, but what it is, it's the way that the brain is wired, and really what the brain's trying to do is always keep you safe. So if you've had a particular traumatic experience, it's almost as if your brain's trying to process that and trying to predict, you know, when that might happen again, because it wants to avoid that. It wants to keep you safe. Obviously, the traumatic experience was very scary for you. It was a difficult thing to go through. Yeah. And really what it wants to do is it wants to protect you. So that can be an explanation of why we might experience trauma. And really what happens is in the brain, trauma is almost like stored in the amygdala, which is the part of the brain that we describe as like the record keeper. So it keeps like records of like, different events and things, and it stores that in the mind. And what it tries to do is with a traumatic event, it tries to process it. So it will look at it from all different angles. So for example, it might have made a connection between particular images that you saw when you had that traumatic experience, particular sounds or music that you heard, or even particular, scents and smells. So it's almost what it's doing is it's collecting like all the information surrounding that particular traumatic event, and it's almost like kind of trying to process that, I suppose, and trying to unpick that about it happened when this song was playing, and it's like almost like making a connection, like so it's almost like predicting that next time you like that song plays, it's like the same thing, I suppose it's like the brain's way of trying to predict situations and trying to keep us safe. And in terms of like examples of when you might experience like trauma or traumatic events, like it's different for every person. Like we said, obviously it's very individual. Each person will for what's traumatic for one person won't be traumatic for another person. But just to give you some examples, things like maybe being in a car accident, maybe having a medical procedure done, the death of like a loved one, maybe it was like unexpected or it was sudden. It might be people who have maybe experienced like abuse, whether that's physical, emotional, sexual, domestic, whatever that might be. And I think there's something there as well about it's like the intensity of how scary and how frightening that experience was for you. And the main thing is, I think the biggest thing is it's that idea of being out of control, not having control over it. So I suppose when it comes to trauma, like one thing you might notice is there certain things that trigger you. Trigger you, it might just mean like, you smell a certain scent that takes you back to that time when you went through an experience, or you hear a certain song that just takes your memory right back. So it's just about how we store that information in the brain and how we process that.
Yeah, it sounds like there's so many possible situations where people can walk away from it and feeling like they've experienced trauma and very much linked to our own responses to how we felt in that moment. And I think that is a really important point. And one of the things that we know it can sometimes buffer some of the significant experiences that we have is our access to resources, and that's resources in terms of our networks and levels of resilience and what else is working well in our life. So sometimes it's the timing of specific events and how they're experienced will impact our ability to then move on and cope with it. I think one thing that is number one advice for anybody that feels they've experienced something that's been quite a traumatic for them and has impacted them significantly is to seek mental health professional for support. And psychologists can help with this, psychiatrists can help with this, and it's very much about reaching out to someone that has a specialism in trauma who can support you through that process at a pace that feels okay for you. And there's specific evidence-based interventions that you can work through with a therapist, a psychologist, to really help move through some of those really difficult experiences. I think linked to that is how we sit with our emotions from a traumatic experience, and what we often do is try and avoid them. Why would you want to run towards something that feels really overwhelming and scary? So it's quite a typical response to disconnect. But what we know is if we do disconnect, detach from what we're feeling, it's likely to come up at a later point. So we sometimes find that people come for professional support and advice much further down the line from the incident, because actually it keeps bubbling up and spilling over when maybe a something else happens that hasn't had such a big impact, but it's built up over time.
And I think as well, like people, like sometimes when they've been through a traumatic experience, like there's that element of being in shock or being in denial, like, you know, and things like that. So people are really working through that as well. So that explains why people would come at a later stage like, to try and get some help with that.
Absolutely. And that's the thing with it being an individual experience, that some people can feel that shock and detach from it immediately. Some people might feel that they have the capacity to deal with and move through those emotions quicker, depending what's going on for them and in their lives. And I think just knowing what will come up for you is really important. So that links to educating yourself around trauma can be really helpful. I mean, hopefully this conversation helps people in doing that, but just being prepared of what you might experience and knowing that that's actually very normal and expected after feeling like you've had this traumatic experience is going to support somebody to move through some of those emotions that are very difficult at a pace that's right for them.
Yeah.
Knowing that we have to face these quite difficult things that come up in order to begin to build our capacity to cope again. And with that, we think about things like resilience and okay, how can we support our resilience when we've experienced something so significant? Support network is definitely key to that. Being around people that can provide some understanding, listening, and validation for what you're going through, and being around people that you trust to open up to it's just crucial to being able to overcome these situations. And also thinking about how you might set goals for yourself, because what we find after experiencing a significant event that feels traumatic is that it really can challenge your sense of self, and it can sometimes impact our self-esteem naturally, because we're feeling that the world is a scary place, and that we might even feel that people are scary to approach. The unknownness of the world can become amplified. So having thinking about ways to build resilience and self-esteem, like setting yourself small tasks that you can complete each day, and whether that's a project that you're working on, whether that's through the expressive arts, drama, art, it can be really helpful things just for building that sense of self-esteem and knowing that you are accomplishing things and really celebrating the things that you're able to accomplish at a rate that feels okay for you.
Yeah, no, they sound fantastic. Some great ideas you've got there. One thing I was thinking that could be helpful for some people might be, you know, putting together like a self-care box and just like having like a little box where you just fill it with things that would be meaningful to you. So in the box, you might want to put in like, you know, favourite book, maybe like a scented candle, like just to help you relax. Some people really find lavender relaxing, like so maybe some lavender, things like that. You could also have things like, you know, puzzles or maybe like colouring in books. Like, you know, you get the mindfulness like colouring in. And lots of people can find colouring in to be very therapeutic, you know, just and it can just help you process your thoughts and things like that. And it's quite relaxing for people to do. You might also maybe have like a photograph of like a loved one or like a really nice memory that just like kind of takes you back to like a, you know, a good memory that you have. And some people might find like motivational quotes or like, you know, like some encouraging notes to themselves. Like you might be writing things like when you are in a good place and like just like so you can refer back to when maybe you are struggling, like maybe you are being triggered and things like that. But I suppose like a self-care box will look completely different for each person depending on obviously what's important to them. So it's important that you make it meaningful for you. And some people might like to put things in it, like, you know, a stress ball or like fidget toys or things like that, like just like kind of like things like to keep their hands busy, because lots of people find that when they keep their hands busy, it gives them a kind of sense of like relaxation and things. So that's something that people could do. And you could keep it somewhere that's, you know, maybe it's easy access, maybe in your living room or your bedroom, whatever is easy for you. And you know that when you are going through a particularly difficult time, you can go to your self-care box and you've already prepared for it, and you've got little like tools and strategies and things that can help you feel a bit better. You might even want to put a notebook in there as well and a pen and just like journal your thoughts and things like that. So but yeah, it's just like a special box for you to create, and it doesn't have to be anything fancy. It could even just be like an old shoe box that you've got, and you fill it with different things, just whatever really works for you. And I suppose it links to what you had said about educating yourself about trauma and knowing what to look out for and things. One thing that you could do is really get to know and understand your own triggers. You know, what are the things that really trigger you? Because the better of an understanding that we have of this, the better we can prepare for when these triggers do appear. So it might just be maybe having like a mood diary, like just like writing down, like, you know, like when you felt a certain way and like what was the situation around it, what did you see, what did you hear, what did you feel, and it would just like kind of maybe help you understand what are the things that trigger you the most, just so you can keep an eye out for it in the future. So that's the kind of things that I would recommend.
And they feel like really helpful things that people can start straight away as well. I love the idea of a self-care box, and you could use that beyond traumatic experiences, and you know, when you might be experiencing a low mood or having a difficult day, it's just something nice to come back to.
It? Yeah. We should all have a special box.
Exactly, it lifts you in that moment. And recognising your triggers is crucial, because identifying those helps you to prepare for when they might come up, and sometimes just that preparation and knowing what might come up for us is really helpful. So I think that draws us very much to the end of our episode of Do You Ever Feel Overwhelmed by Emotions? Thinking about trauma. Thank you everybody for listening. Just a reminder that if you do feel like you've been affected by a traumatic experience, or you're struggling with your mental health at the moment, please do reach out to a mental health professional who can provide you with further specialised support and advice. Thank you.